run out of prefixes, suffixes, and roots to identify new concepts. It's an interesting question to Google. For example, what are the new words that have just been created in the last year or two? They've got some information on 1288 for you on Stephanie Strickland, a contemporary connection, hypertext poetry pioneer. Take the power of poetry to evoke emotion and change the imagination and combine it with the power of new media, and you get what some are calling a new literary genre, hypertext or electronic poetry. Hypertext poetry presents text with graphics, images, sound, and live links to other texts. By choosing particular links, the reader shapes his or her own reading experience. Poet Stephanie Strickland is a hypertext pioneer whose works live on the web. Words dance on the screen, images shimmer, colors swirl. The reader becomes a viewer, a listener, a participant. An artfully lettered phrase drifts across the screen and turns like a falling leaf while a wave crashes behind it, and then more phrases follow. On the one hand, Strickland simply does what poets have always done, which is engage readers' senses and emotions. However, she uses more than her words in her creation of poetry. Readers might wonder then, is this a new generation of poetry or a different art form entirely? Just because it's easy to enjoy, is it easy to understand? In an interview in the Iowa Web Review, Strickland offers some insight. Quote, "My poetry wants to move from static movement to dynamic movement because that is the way the world feels to me," end quote. I would definitely recommend that you Google her later and just take a look at what kind of work she does. 1289. What is postmodern in American literature? Postmodern signals works created after modernism. Here are some of the qualities that help to define postmodern literature. 1. Awareness of itself. A postmodern work is self-conscious. A postmodern character might refer to the novel he lives in, and a postmodern writer might comment on the story or poem the reader is reading. 2. Release from meaning. World War II, the atomic bomb, and the Holocaust undercut reliance on rational meaning and the assumption that a work of art could or needed to mean anything at all. 3. Inner interest in process. A postmodern work is recognized as an ongoing experience. Some works offer alternative versions of themselves. 4. Desire to revise the past. A postmodern work does not hesitate to use the past extensively, even re-seeing and rewriting it. And finally, desire to have fun. A postmodern work does not take itself so seriously. It may merge high and low culture. It may feel like a game. Final question, which American writers are pointing us toward the future? American writing of extraordinary beauty, passion, imagination, and zest continues to tell us who we are and who we can become. You've got some really important suggestions here going on. Toni Morrison's Beloved from 1987, an acclaimed narrative of slavery and sacrifice told in a challenging mosaic style. Andretta Barrett's Ship Fever, 1996, gripping stories that interweave fiction, history, science. And finally, Dave Eggers' A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius from 2000, a postmodern family memoir of profound compassion. And then you've got a list of any number of other writers there of 21st century origin, and all of those are worthy to be Googled. By the way, take a look at your essential question vocabulary work there as well for those 3 words provided. You have an introduction to Julio Alvarez on page 1290, 1291. We're going to be looking at a story by Julio Alvarez here in a second. And we'll just read about her for a second. All-American writer. She's now writing. Let's just read what she has to say on 1290, 1291. People often ask me, how come I became an American writer? Often there's a tone of surprise, for although I was born in New York City, my Dominican parents returned home when I was a month old. I grew up in another culture and language. I like to respond to the question by saying, I'm an all-American writer. My love of stories and many of my characters and even the cadences of my English sentences come from the Southern Americas and the musical Rococo extravagances of Spanish, whereas the language I've learned to craft and the literary tradition I've studied comes from the northern part of the Americas. I truly am an all-American writer in the more expansive hemispheric sense. I grew up in a culture steeped in the oral tradition of storytelling. Stories were shared within a community or family gathering, not through the solitary act of reading. In part, we were living in a repressive dictatorship where books marked you as an intellectual, a troublemaker. People relied on Radio Bimba, Radio Big Mouth. Stories were passed on from one teller to another, keeping the love of freedom alive. When we escaped in 1960, leaving everything behind, I carried with me this love and respect for the power of stories. top of page 1291. We arrived in a United States that was not very welcoming to foreigners who looked and acted different, who spoke English with an accent. I felt homesick and lost until I discovered the world of written down stories where everyone was welcomed. I became a reader and again realized the power of stories. Reading, I could become a Danish prince or a young Greek girl wanting to bury her dead brother or an old man on a boat trying to catch a fish. I no longer felt so lonely or lost. The more I read, the more I wanted to contribute to this great circle of storytellers. I had stories to tell, and by writing them down, I could share them with an invisible community of readers that were to become my new native country. But I had entered a United States where the civil rights movement was just getting underway. The women's movement, multiculturalism, Native American rights, all these awakenings were still to come. Literature itself reflected these biases. There wasn't a diversity of authors of different traditions and backgrounds in our anthologies and in the curriculum in our classrooms. Since none of the classics we were studying were written by people like me, I began to doubt that I could become an American writer. But then in one of those anthologies among absent voices and missing stories, I found the Langston Hughes poem, I Too Sing America. Of course, we've studied this poem, right? It was magic to my ears. I understood that Mr. Hughes was saying he was claiming his place in the chorus of American song, an America that was still not listening to him, still treating him as a second-class literary citizen sent to the kitchen of minor writers instead of allowing him a place at the table of American literature. But no matter, Mr. Hughes knew that tomorrow he'd be at the table. The fact that Mr. Hughes's poem was in my textbook meant his dream had come true. This was an important voice for a young girl of another culture and language and background with her heart full of dreams to hear. In my lifetime, I've been lucky enough to experience a sea change in what is considered American literature. When I started writing in the late 60s, the work of my fellow Latino writers and other so-called ethnic writers was still considered the province of sociology. But in the late 70s and early 80s, influenced by the opening up to the canon of African American and women's literature, writers of other traditions within the United States were suddenly, quote-unquote, discovered. Just as Columbus, quote-unquote, discovered an America that was already home to old cultures and traditions who had been writing for several decades, began to be welcomed at Mr. Hughes's table. It's an expansion that has enriched American literature, all these varied cadences and stories from so many different traditions. It's a richness that is truly at the heart of America, as Walt Whitman, the quintessential American poet, knew way back when he wrote, I hear America singing the varied carols I hear. This has always been a country made up of people who came from somewhere else, encountering the people who preceded them here. Out of this encounter can come silencing and segregation, as we mentioned with Tilly Olson's classic little essay, Silences. But also, and this can be our greatness, a more inclusive and astonishingly diverse country and culture. Literature has always been about this multiculturalism, about becoming each other and realizing that we share the same human experiences. Stories have always known that the table is wide enough for all of us. Langston Hughes and Walt Whitman and Raymond Carver and Maxine Kong Kingsman, and even an all-American writer born in New York City but raised in the Dominican Republic, Julio Alvarez. There's also room for you, so pull up a chair, because if you want to be a writer, you have to become a reader first. As we have said before to you, almost every time you meet a professional writer, he or she will always say, you have to read, you have to read. Of course, we've defined reading in here as the capacity to connect new to old. Notice the genius. She will mention a poem by Langston Hughes that we have worked with called I Too Sing America. And in that moment when she read the poem, notice how she interpreted the poem. She interpreted the poem as Langston Hughes himself saying, someday I want to be at the table with other writers, famous writers like Walt Whitman. By table, obviously, we're speaking here metaphorically. All right, well, we're going to turn next to a story by Julio Alvarez here in a second. We'll get there on page 1294 in a second. Let's take a break. We'll come right back. Thank you.